Well, hello everyone. You're listening and watching Rashkin Report, and I'm your host Yuri Rashkin. And I'm excited to be joined by a couple of very distinguished gentlemen that we're going to discuss some really interesting things with about historically speaking, and that is how we all got here in some kind of shape or form. And I'm excited because Mark Pomar and Peter Basilevsky are going to be able to really help me create, I think, a much more complete understanding of this process of immigration out of Russia, which seems to go in waves. And so, the so-called first wave, although there was always, people trying to leave Russia and get into the United States, in our for the case of our discussion, let's begin with the so-called first wave, which is what occurred after the revolution of 1917. And that's where Peter is so uniquely qualified to speak about this, because Peter's grandfather was Peter Vrangel, who was, a seminal military leader of the other side that lost to the Reds and the communists. But there were heroes on the other side, and Peter Vrangel was one of them. And so Peter Wasilewski is going to kind of he was Peter. You were born not in Russia, but you clearly have a lot of Russian roots. Can you talk a little bit about what immigration was like for you and for your family?
Well, um, of course, it was. I mean, the single word you could use is disruptive. I think every immigration, to one degree or another, is disruptive. It means even those that might leave for economic reasons, or who have planned to leave or whatever. It's always a disruptive experience for those that emigrated as a result of the revolution. It was doubly so because they were basically forced to leave. It was done under very rapid circumstances. Many of them were fleeing for their lives. There was, obviously they had to leave behind all of their belongings and whatever financial resources they had. And actually, there's a little interesting story that people don't know. Even those that were in the aristocracy in Russia, who may have had substantial resources in Europe before World War I, such as my family did. At the beginning of World War I, the Russian government made a big push to have all those with foreign assets convert them and buy war bonds, Russian war bonds, which in fact my family did, with the result that after the revolution, all of that disappeared. So most of the people that left in the so-called first wave left with really nothing, and were therefore thrown into circumstances where they were either, for many of them, had no language skills other than Russian. Now, again, there were classes of society, for example, the upper classes oftentimes were educated, had nannies, and were homeschooled in other languages, such as in my family. But for the bulk of the people, and there were over 2 million, probably maybe even 3 million people that fled Russia, just many of them just ordinary people. They were thrown into circumstances where they had to find a job to survive, to find a place to live, to just culturally acclimate to circumstances which oftentimes are totally foreign. There's always the anecdote that all the taxi drivers in Paris were Russians, that the doormen and Russian clubs were retired generals because they'd be standing there in their uniforms. All of these kind of things. There's an interesting thing. People generally are remarkable as to how they can adapt. I think I said in one of the prior presentations we did that women oftentimes were the ones that actually worked. A lot of them became domestics, but a lot of them, who, particularly those from the upper classes, who grew up in circumstances of privilege where they were exposed to, the best clothes, etc., when they wound up in Europe, and I'm speaking principally of Europe here, what did they know? Well, they know good clothes. So they opened up couturier shops, which in fact, my grandmother did, my great aunt, three of my great aunts did. And some of them were quite successful. There were also many Russians that were former actors and, stepped on the stage or in the movies. So, for example, in Berlin and in Paris, in Hollywood, Nazimova, who was a big star in the silent movies in Hollywood, was Russian, as were a lot of Russians. As a matter of fact, if you go to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, as I have been in, you'll see a remarkable number of Orthodox crosses for Russians who are buried there. So it was a remarkable emigration. I'll tell you, the other thing is, it was a worldwide emigration. It wasn't just in Europe, it was in Australia. A lot of the people, as I've said earlier, left via Siberia and wound up in China. After the communist revolution there, they wound up in Australia, they wound up in Japan, and a lot of them wound up on the west coast of the United States. There's a man who has done a whole series of photographic books, which are really quite good, by the name of Andrei Karyakov, on the immigration of the emigres in Paris, in France. But there were others. I mean, Spain. There was an interesting thing what happened after the revolution. As I sort of mentioned, there were people sitting in those that left southern Russia with my grandfather were sitting in Turkey and the French wanted to get rid of them, and there was a proposal to resettle them in Brazil. And there was a big group, there was a whole big push, and it was a push to get them to go to Brazil. Turned out later that it was terrible because they came and they became virtually slaves. I mean, it was slave labor, really functionally slave labor that put them to work in the fields, etc. But the result is there is a rather large Russian first wave contingent in South America, in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile. So they were scattered all over the world. And everywhere they wound up, they had to somehow adapt. And by and large, they did it rather remarkably well. Now, there were certain things that were helping settle them. For example, and I think I mentioned this before, the ambassador to the United States from the Russian court, from the imperial government, was a man by the name of Bakhmetyev, who was actually a civil engineer by training, went on to teach at Columbia University. But before he left, he transferred funds on deposit in New York, government funds, into his personal account. Now, what he did with that fund is really quite remarkable. He bought a match factory in Brooklyn, okay, otherwise known to all of us as the Spitzenfabrik. Spitzenfabrik. And so all those that came who were really, uneducated, etc., and wound up in New York or thereabouts, they had jobs. Then there was other, for example, another example, Helena Rubinstein, okay, who was, a very well-known woman she was very partial to Russians. So she hired a lot of Russians. Translations. Now, this is later. This is more out of Mark's generation, etc. But a lot of, for example, the early UN translators were a lot of immigrants who came over. And Mark can talk about that whole group. So that earliest group wound up, and obviously when they settled, or when they arrived in New York and they got off the boat. And believe me, it was really getting off the boat. Back then, still Ellis Island was still cooking. And a lot of them came through Ellis Island. So then they'd wind up in New York. And then they dispersed. And how do immigrants disperse? Well, it's very typical. Okay. You have sort of the pathfinder. Now, the pathfinder can be an individual. It can be the church. Remember, the Russian Orthodox Church was in the United States from the 18th century, from the days of Alaska. So there's a natural tendency to gravitate to an area where other people, either people from the same village, from the same city, or who are relatives or who are known to each other. That's what happened to my family. We wound up, as I said before, in a little town, a little village called Seacliff on the North Shore of Long Island, where there was 1, 2, 3 families. And before you know it, we wound up with 2 Russian Orthodox churches, one from the 20s and one from post-World War II, from the Rokor and the Synod. So we actually wound up with a Russian mayor at one point. So it all kind of spreads,
Right.
The adaptability is. Then you have people who really were stars. One of the big stars was Sikorsky, Igor Sikorsky, who settled in Connecticut, in Stratford, and among other things, he built a church. And there were a lot of Russians that went to work for him, principally engineers. There were the first wave of immigrants. There were a lot of educated people that got out, who had higher education, who were professionals, and they wound up getting out. What were the other centers of immigration? Again, focusing on Europe, obviously Berlin was very big. Prague, very big. That was a major one. And then the Balkans, Bulgaria and Romania, although to a lesser extent, people were moving out. And then there was a large group that originally wound up in Yugoslavia that stayed in Yugoslavia and in Serbia. And Mark can speak to that group as well. So there was people in Poland. But the problem was that as things progressed, more and more people, either through an initial immigration and a subsequent immigration, moved further west and wanted to get out. That happened to my family. As I said before, after World War II, my family, at least the Basilevskys, my immediate family, was worried that Stalin was going to continue marching to the Atlantic Ocean. So they wanted to get as far away as they possibly could, and then we emigrated to the United States. So there was people who emigrated out of Russia, out of the first wave, the first post-revolutionary period, who wound up being, in effect, the second wave after World War II. So you had kind of a multiple stage. There were members of the initial wave who actually became members of the second wave, if you think of the Second World War as the second wave.
And people moving more westward.
Yes, to get the hell away from that one, from Uncle Joe. So it's very interesting. And as I said before, obviously immigration, there's different kinds of immigration. Okay. There's immigration that is forced by just simply changes in territorial control. I mean, war occurs, you're somewhere stuck and you just have to leave because, you want to, because you've been taken over and you're fleeing, if you will. I had an aunt, for example, who was in East Germany. And as the Germans were marching in, she and her family literally walked she told me about 600 miles westward to get the hell out so that the Soviet army wasn't going to wind up. And that happened to lots of people. The flow of people, migrations, one or the other, it's been, as long as there's been history, there's been migratory kinds of things happening. But so anyway, the story of immigrants and emigres. Mark Ryev has written an interesting book. By the way, I don't know, Mark, if you know him, and
He was my advisor at Columbia.
Well, voila. He wrote a very good book on
Yes, he did.
the
Yes, he
immigration.
did. And we actually spent lots of time comparing notes, and he told me about his he was very funny. He always insisted on Imя Отчество. And so he was Izrailevich to me, and I was Markisakovich to, I would say, and he would call me Mark Dmitrievich, and we had this wonderful exchange. It was very proper and formal and very typical of the first emigration.
Yeah.
To be very correct and very polite and very discerning in terms of your interaction. If I
And then we take the next step down to the second wave.
Well, let me just sort of come back to some of the points that Peter made. I agree with very much, but I would say that at least in my circles, what distinguished the second and first emigration was whether or not you had Soviet experience.
Yeah.
If you did not have Soviet experience and you were a child of the first emigration, you were sort of the first emigration. So my parents grew up, my mother in Yugoslavia, my father in Poland, but they had never set foot in the Soviet Union. They never went to Soviet school. They had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. They went to Russian schools, elementary and high school, and then to universities in their home countries. So they didn't grow up Soviet. That made them, by definition, sort of first emigration children. My grandparents, obviously, like Peter's, were adults educated before the revolution. They're 30 years old when the revolution took place, and of course, lost whatever they had in those years. But I think what makes the second emigration sort of a fascinating one is that they, for the most part, fled the Soviet Union during World War II and ended up avoiding repatriation, which was a very, very big problem, where they were forcibly repatriated into horrible conditions once they went back to the Soviet Union, mostly the Gulag, and sometimes shot if they were suspected of helping the Germans. But you could only survive in World War II if you were somehow perceived to be doing some kind of labor. Now, a lot of that was forced labor, but nonetheless, you had to work in some kind of camp environment. And that's where my parents ended up meeting in a camp outside of Munich, where a lot of the first emigration and first emigration children mixing with second emigration all ended up. And there's a recent book by a Russian-German scholar on the camp in Schleißheim, which was the largest of the camps in post-World War II Germany, which had a large Russian, mostly second emigration community. They set up schools, they set up theaters, they set up church, they set up, my grandfather was a priest there in Schleißheim, and that was where, and from there they got dispersed pretty much around the world, many to Canada, many to the United States. And I was actually able, through this scholar in Germany, to get, Peter, you might find this interesting, the DP tickets for my parents and grandparents and what they did and where they were and how they explained how they got to Germany. Those documents are releasable to relatives through contacts. I found it absolutely fascinating to see that.
It's a pretty small number, though, this the second wave, because I think first is quite substantial.
Hundreds of thousands.
Mark, there's a friend of mine who you may know, Anatoly Shmelev, who's at the Hoover Institute. He just wrote a book about the DP camps, and it's a rather interesting. He did a presentation in New York, on which I served as a panelist, but on talking about his book and what he did, his studies on the DP camps.
And more is being explored precisely in that second immigration. Now, some of them, let's be honest, some of them were very active in participating with the Germans and had to find circuitous ways to get out and not be repatriated. But for the most part, they were desperate to survive, as any human being would be under very trying conditions.
Mark, I'm just really curious because I don't quite understand, how were they able to not get repatriated, but instead, get to the United States, for instance?
people like my mother, who took a very active role in that, would teach them how to answer questions that they grew up in Belgrade. And she would draw them maps and tell them what their address would be and how they would tell that they had gone to this high school and this was the teacher that they had. In other words, people such as my mother were tutoring them on how to answer the questions so that when they were before these panels, they could show that they were Russians who had grown up in Yugoslavia or in Warsaw or in Prague or whatever other city. And this was an effort that my mother took great pride in having helped many of them, and they became in years very, very close friends.
You know, Yuri, there's a huge stain on Winston Churchill's reputation, which he acknowledged, because he participated as there was, there was a deal cut in at the meeting in Yalta between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And Stalin came in and he said he wanted anybody who was, I think it was the cutoff was 1939, who was Russian or et cetera. After 1939, he wanted them repatriated. Okay. And in fact, of all of the allies, the Brits were the worst in terms of taking people out of camps and sending them back to Russia. There was a terrible situation at Linitz in Austria. As a matter of fact, these were Cossacks, and if you go to the Cossack Museum, there's a very well-known. There's now a chapel there. There's a well-known painting of what happened in Linitz, of the forced repatriation of Cossacks. It was so bad that mothers were throwing their babies into the river, and they were jumping off because they did not want to be repatriated. If you talk to Cossacks, that is a very, and that was done with the Brits. The Americans, on the other hand, and I know stories of this. The American guards at those camps that were Americans, when the stories would come up about repatriation, they would turn their back and they would and they'd kind of open the gates and people fled.
Absolutely. Peter, I grew up as a child, as you did. To me, that the Cossack story is embedded in me from the age of 5 or 6. And I mean, this is what it was. Yuri, you should ask us what it is to grow up in the United States with all of this history absolutely embedded in your head from the earliest childhood. These are our childhood stories. This is how we grew up. Peter might
this is from the land that you've never been in at that point.
Doesn't matter. It is the power of the family.
It's in the DNA.
It's just something we live with. I write, by the way, in my book, I write about the Cossacks being and the repatriation. In honor of my mother, who died a few years ago, I had to put that story in because to her, it was one of the monumental stories of her years as a young woman in the 20s. You see, Yuri, and everything I listen to Peter, I know exactly what he's going to say next because it is exactly the way I grew up, and it's exactly the way with some of the very same stories, with the very same points, because it is that culture. It is a specific of our generation, American Russian culture. Now, I will also add, and Peter, I think, would agree with me wholeheartedly, that if you were to ask my grandparents, whom I knew very well, they all lived into their 90s practically, they may have left Russia physically, geographically, but culturally, morally, spiritually, they took real Russia. Real Russia perished in the Soviet Union. They never would have accepted that Russia was the Soviet Union. To them, it was some false, weird, strange, alien force that had taken over their country, their language, their people. And so, Россия за границей. We are the real Russia. They are the fake Russia. And now by my parents' generation, that kind of got watered down. My parents didn't really know it, but they followed their parents' sort of parroting. But wouldn't you agree, Peter?
Yeah, well, I'll take it one step further, Mark. I'll take it one step further. Not only did they take it with them, but as I said earlier in one of the early things, some really believed that they could go back. So there was that group. Okay, because they couldn't believe that the Soviet Union could survive, all right, and that it would last. They all said, "Oh, это все разрушится и blah blah." Okay, so there were some. There were others, and this is interesting. There were others that just basically did go back voluntarily. I mentioned Maria Tsvetaeva, the poetess, but there were others. And then there were people who actually were involved in attempts to sabotage, etc. There's, if you know the story of, they made a popular movie, Riley, Ace of Spies. Okay,
Sure.
the Brits did that. Sam Neill. It's a good movie. It's actually fun to see. But there was this whole thing about the Trust, yeah. Which was this fake underground organization in Russia that the OGPU and Dzerzhinsky cooked up, that attracted a lot of people thinking that they were going to go back and they were going to actually participate in the demise of the Soviet Union. And I had a relative, as a matter of fact, who went back and disappeared.
Yeah.
So
there was also the NTS.
Yes,
the Voice Soyuz,
still going.
Still going, but it's also very much now in line probably with Putin. But what I found interesting in that speech, Yuri, that Putin gave last week about the annexation, he only had one person that he quoted. Ilyin. And Ivan Ilyin was the patron saint of the NTS. He was the one that they bowed before, the one that they quoted all the time, the one who was their favorite. And
who's now buried in the Donskoy Monastery.
Of course, repatriated back to so there's a lot of linkages that go back in very interesting ways from the more conservative side of the emigration. There was the more liberal side, there was the more conservative side.
So let me ask you this. Do you think your relatives would have recognized the Russia that has emerged when Soviet Union collapsed? Or was that Russia, the authentic Russia, was forever gone?
Oh, my grandparents and Peter's would have passed away before 1991. There's no way they could have gone. My mother did go back.
Mine did too.
Yeah, but you were born, well, okay. My mother went back and she found it interesting. She didn't find it particularly, of course, she didn't grow up in the Soviet Union. So for her, it's still kind of a foreign country, but she found it interesting and she found some distant relatives and she got together with them and basically.
Well, I told you the story, but I don't know if I did tell you the story or not, but my mother went back. She went back several times actually. And the first time she went back with me was in 1990. My mother was born in St. Petersburg in 1913. So she remembers vaguely, but she remembers being taken in a pram through Yitainly Sat, in St. Petersburg. And of course, in 1990, she went back under circumstances where she was appalled, of the economic circumstances. I think I said that we saw the little old ladies who were begging in front of the Lavra. But I think
that's real Russia, isn't it? That's not communist.
But she was appalled at what had happened. In other words, the thing, she was always, she was a Russian. She really was a Russian. So when Serbia was bombed and the Russians were appalled, et cetera, she was as appalled as the Russian government was. But I think, you don't see, you have to understand communism to us, to my family, etc., was an existential evil. Mm-hmm. It was the devil's handiwork. There's no compromise with communism.
I totally agree. I mean, 100%.
There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It was, if you're going to look at good and evil, that's evil. All right. And as a result, you deal with it just in that way. It's evil. For us, most recently, I was approached to have my grandfather's remains transferred back to Russia. This was in 2007. And, we said, thank you very much, but look, 50% of Russians think that Stalin was a great man, and all his palachis sitting there in the wall right behind him, or now joining him because he got kicked out of the mausoleum. But other than that, I mean, and it started even with Lenin. I mean, so you can't, can you compromise with evil? I don't think you can.
I
can throw in.
No, go ahead, Mark.
I was going to throw in maybe a little bit of a curveball and say that there is, unfortunately, and I'm not that close to it anymore, but there is in the Russian emigre community, I'm thinking of the Russian church abroad, the one that now joined, is really, to my mind, gone down a very, very bad path. And I think it split families, it split my family. I mean, I have relatives who are in one church, relatives who are not in any church, and there's no dialogue. I mean, the Ukraine war in particular has really split the older, I think, emigre families.
Do you know the irony?
I don't even talk to my cousin anymore. I mean, that's how bad it's gone.
Yeah, but Mark, there's an overriding irony in that. An irony in that. I mean, I grew up in the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America, which was sort of the lineal descendant of the original emigre and missionary church in the United States, dating back from the 18th century. ROKOR, or the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which principally came with the Second World War, had always been traditionally horrendously anti-communist. Not horrendously, absolutely anti-communist. As a matter of fact, it was the center of anti-communism. And as a matter of fact, they used to, didn't like us in the OCA because we were Americans. We were an American church, okay? Which is interesting because the church is going through all kinds of problems now in the Ukraine with, as they refer to it, автокефалия, okay, individual. So anyway, so the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was enormously anti-communist. I have in my possession a letter from then Mitropolit Kirill, now the patriarch, right, anathemizing ROKOR. I swear to God, anathemizing ROKOR. So then Putin makes this little trip to New York, and he meets with Mitropolit Laurus, and lo and behold, they sort of become part of the Moscow Patriarchate, which now, as Mark rightly points out, is a sore subject. And as a matter of fact, a friend of mine, Lina Zizulina, just wrote an article about maybe it's time to undo the knot, as the saying goes, that connects the two. It's a problem, and so Mark is absolutely right. There's always been currents in the emigre community, and I'll give you another example. This goes back to the 1920s. All right, in Paris in 1920, there was an organization created by sort of leading politicians from Russia, pre-revolutionary Russia. It was a lot of social democrats, a lot of cadets, sort of constitutional Democrats, etc. There's a guy in particular by the name of Milyukov who was in charge. And if you know something about Tsarist history, and he was a leader in the Duma of the kind of the left. Okay, so they were sitting in Paris. My grandfather, meanwhile, had his government in the south of Russia, in the Crimea, and there was they were saying, don't support Vrangel, he's a monarchist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there were all these currents. So there was definitely a group of Russian emigres in Paris who were left, who were social democrats, who were cadets, and who were, now they weren't particularly, in favor of the Bolsheviks, but they were certainly not in the Ilyin group. Of Russian nationalists. And by the way, let's take a look at that, because I think that bears some examination given Putin's speech. Okay, Ilyin.
Yeah, and I will just say quickly that Ilyin is somebody that people in Russia, he's not that widely known from what I'm gathering in Russia, but because he's super important to Putin, it becomes very, very important person.
Okay, now Ilyin. This is very interesting. Ilyin now, among Russian politicians or political commentary, he's labeled as a fascist. And in fact, he was an anti-Semite. He was writing in Germany. He was in Berlin, and he was really supporting the Nazis. And even post World War II, he did some anti, well, let's assume sort of pro-Nazi kind of commentary. And as a result, a lot of people in the white movement were tarred with a kind of a fascist brush. To be honest, okay, during World War II, there was a lot of Russians that wound up fighting with the Germans under the leadership of a Soviet general who had been captured by the name of Vlasov. But there, for example, one of the leading lights of the whites and the White Army was a man by the name of Krasnov, who was a Cossack general, and he joined, and they formed a division of people who fought on the Eastern Front. Now you have to understand the mentality here. It's the old story of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I mean, these people joined, and Ilyin, I think, was in this same, he was such a яростный anti-communist that he would, he said the only sort of force that was in Europe at the time that was anti-communist were the Nazis. And by the way, if you remember, in the 30s, that was the prince in England. In England, my God, there was a whole group of English. There was Oswald Mosley, and there was a whole group of English landed gentry that were pro-Nazis. I mean, some say that Edward VIII was a pro-Nazi. So, and what was the linchpin of that? It was the fear of Bolshevism, and that was driving them to say that the Nazis were the greatest thing, or was the bulwark of Western civilization against this threat of Bolshevism. Okay, so people, it's very difficult to paint with a big brush everybody, and make overall generalizations, because even within a group, any group, there's always going to be people who are going to aren't going to be, lockstep in the way they look at things, particularly political things. So Ilyin, there's no question that he was kind of, Mark is absolutely right. He was sort of the philosopher of the white movement, but he had some dark, he had some spots, if you will, and.
But I mean, I would presume that it's not because of that whole history that was necessarily appealing to Putin. It's that worldview that is appealing to Putin.
Well, Ilyin, first and foremost, Yuri, was a nationalist. He was a Russian nationalist. As far as he was concerned, he was a Russian nationalist. I don't know if you know that, I don't know if you agree with me, Mark, but I was brought up with the theory that if you look in the Bible and if you look in Revelations, that the savior of the world was going to arise from the east, and there was a lot of this. There was this, this sort of theory of Russian nationalism as being something
messianic. Is that the term?
Well,
messianic?
It was something not so much messianic as something unique, and which Putin. He just lays it out. I mean, he absolutely says Russian culture, and he's fighting against this, against the gay parades of the West. He's trying to preserve this, sort of semi-whole, as he puts it, pravoslavne, Russia, I mean, look, it's all crap, to put it bluntly. He's pulling the levers, okay? But it's going to be his speech. If you look at his speech on Friday, it's an interesting speech because it's divided. Okay, he's addressing various groups. He's got a group in the world, which is the traditional leftists. Okay, very appealing. Okay, that's all this business about colonials and all of that stuff. Okay, which, by the way, one of the biggest colonial powers was Russia. Okay, over the years, which is sort of. And then he's got the piece with Ilyin and everything to the Russian side. So,
and then a few gay parades thrown in. Let me make a point. I don't know how much time we have, but I'd love to get Peter's view on this as well. And that is what it was like for Peter and for myself and our generation, to grow up at the same time, kind of with one foot in one culture, one foot in the other. American schooling, at the same time, you have this family and community that you know very well, very intimately. And the way you balance that, and you can become a very good critic of certainly of knowing what to pay attention to. Now, what I found when I worked at the radios to be extremely useful was that I could be kind of in both worlds in the same time. So I would be among the Americans at an early morning meeting with the president of RFERL, and they would never really be comments, those crazy emigres in the Russian service. They're going to do something nutty again. You got to watch out for what they're going to put on the air. They're going to put too much of ED in. They're going to get us into trouble. So I'm listening to them. I'm one of them. I'm one of the American managers. I go down the hall to the Russian service, and of course in Russian they say, those idiot Americans are черта не знают, глупые как пробка, da-da-da-da-da. And they accept me and speak to me in Russian as a fellow Russian, telling me and there are others. And so by being able to walk from one world to the other in the course of the day, sometimes I could build certain bridges. Sometimes I just realized there were no bridges to build, and that the difference was so great, perceptions were so different, that the best you can do is keep them apart and hope that there wouldn't be any kind of war. But that I found very useful. And as a kid, I don't know, Peter, I sometimes felt when I visited my grandparents that I left the United States and I went to some old world Russia. Then I left that, came back to modern America, and going back and forth as a kid, I think, in my case, I think prepared me very well for my subsequent career.
Well, I'm just so fascinated by the concept of having one foot in the culture that really doesn't exist on that mass scale because the country is doing something entirely different. And yet this kind of Russia, like frozen in time, continues to exist. It's a very like a elegant concept.
It wouldn't happen now. And by the way, my relatives who are much younger, a generation younger than me, already, if they speak Russian, it's very, very poor. Most of them don't speak Russian. But they've been to Russia. They probably have seen more of the country, certainly, than I saw as a young man. But they don't have that deep sense of the culture at all. They're already
so when gentlemen, when you look at I mean, I think it's unavoidable. We have to talk about the events of the day a little bit. When you look at what's going on, the war in Ukraine, are you looking at this? Do you feel like, you know, because when I tell my students that I'm bilingual, they start saying, "Oh, which language is most comfortable?" Like, really, come on. When you're looking at the war in Ukraine, are you looking at this as an American, or do your roots play a role in how you see what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, for me, I look at it as an American. I mean, you asked, going back to the question of, what was it growing up with 2 feet? Number one, I grew up in what it was essentially a Russian ghetto. Okay, this little small village, everybody was related or knew each other, or the families went back, 3 or 4 generations. So we were kind of, and I remember distinctly in the early 50s, when there was real anti-communist, McCarthy and the Red Scares and all that. I remember one of my classmates in school called me a dirty communist. Okay, I was always kind of an outsider. All right, I've always was an outsider, but from the age of 3 on, through 73 years, I've been immersed in American culture. I've been educated in the United States. I'm a lawyer, retired lawyer, so I've been sort of grounded in kind of American principles of jurisprudence and all of that stuff, which undoubtedly created. However, as a bit of pop psychology, if I ask myself, what's my predilection? Okay, how do I look at life? There are people who are looking forward to what's going to come in the future. I have to be honest, I look backwards. I look at, I'm much more interested in digging up my distant relatives and in my history, not just mine, but, old history. And it's really, to me, my life, my outlook is more of a historical nature than one that is future oriented. I think, frankly, one of the really good things about the United States is, for the most part, most Americans, I think, are future oriented and are looking forward. I'm sort of a prisoner of my background in that sense, in the sense that I'm so grounded in this kind of oppressive history that it's hard to escape.
But you're not a grandson of a czar, so it's not like you have a throne waiting for you or something,
No, it's not that, Yuri. It's a fact that you're brought up as Mark so aptly put it, you're brought up in this kind of cultural milieu. Your whole life is involved with people who you've known who are equally in this sort of milieu. And so when you talk to them, you're talking on a kind of a common language, which is quite different in a way than that. Yes, they're all Americans and, they live their daily lives, but you instantly get into this kind of a common experience, common language. I mean, it's like living in a bloody ghetto, frankly. You're in a silo.
Boy, I find myself agreeing with virtually everything Peter is saying, to the point where I too, by the way, live backwards, sort of thinking back. And my whole book was written precisely because I think back to what happened and where it came from and how I can make sense of it. But I think I would answer as well, as an American for sure. Born here, grew up here, this is my country. I served in the US government very proudly for 11 years, which again, like I take great pride in having been a federal employee. I mean, to me, that's a point of great pride. But the same, and also it's complicated because my father's family is really from Ukraine, and I have Ukrainian roots going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Little tidbit, one of my great uncles, Ioan Pomazansky, was a great musician. Well, he was a very talented. He went to St. Petersburg. Yuri, you might find this interesting, became the choir master of the Mariinsky Theater, married the daughter of Lyadov. And there's a whole musical Pomazansky family in St. Petersburg coming right out of the village next to where my grandfather was born. That was his uncle who went. So it's a very complicated. I have relatives in Ukraine. I send money to Ukraine. I send money to my sister went to near Lutsk, and she said she went to the cemetery, and virtually quarter of the cemetery is all our relatives going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So Ukraine is a very sensitive subject.
Me too.
To boot, it's kind of beyond painful, and I've been there. I've traveled throughout Ukraine, so it has. So I see it both as an American in terms of overall strategy, in terms of rational, on an emotional level. On an emotional level, I very much, I wake up at night, worried, and I can't believe what is happening. I mean, it's kind of a strictly emotional matter. But
me too. I mean, you heard me on one of the things. I mean, as I said, the Basilevsky family goes back to, I mean, the earliest that I've been able to trace it was 1619, and in Melitopol. So, I mean,
it sounds very Ukrainian, yes.
Yeah, I mean, Basilevsky, right? They're always. So anyway, I mean, it's, I take this personally, frankly. I take this personally, notwithstanding the fact that the Vrangel side of the family have fought for Russia for, generations. I really do take this personally. I think on a lot of levels, okay, there's obviously the human level, etc. But it's also, look, I mean, by the same token, I don't want to see the destruction of Russia. I mean, I don't want to see, I mean, the people, as I said, I mean, I think you have to make a distinction between the people and the government. And by government, I mean a broader group.
And it's so much easier to do it in English for some reason. It's just in Russian, they really start to blend more, and it's kind of like how, but in English, I think we're just distant enough where, yes.
The problem is, Yuri, Russians are krepostny. That's the problem.
Slaves. Yeah.
Okay? Так что это высшие власти. Everything is высшие власти. There's no connection. There is no connection between, between the people and the government. If you go back, 300 years.
Now we go to the question of responsibility, and that's a big, long conversation. So let me just, before we're done, I'd like to get your take on this. There's a lot of people leaving Russia right now. There's a lot of men leaving Russia. There's people left. There was there was a wave after or around 24th of February. There was a wave just recently with mobilization. What are your thoughts on this? Is this just another, looks like another time when the best people get up and leave, right?
By the way, if you want to see something that just came out within the last 2 or 3 hours on YouTube, there's this guy that I've mentioned before, Pivovarov, who does really pretty good stuff. And he has gone to all these various places where people are fleeing from Russia. Kazakhstan, I think there was reporting from Ulaanbaatar and in Mongolia, obviously from Tbilisi. I think it's tragic. I really do think it's tragic. It's tragic on a whole different numerous levels. Number one, obviously it's tragic for the people who are fleeing. Whatever you might think, this is not something that they were hoping for, okay? They felt compelled to do it on a lot of different levels and for different reasons. But it's also tragic for the country.
I would say,
and by the way, I was thinking about this as I was watching this thing. You guys are too young to remember, but I lived through this in the 60s because I was subject to the draft. I graduated from Columbia University in 1967. The day I graduated, I got my 1A notice. Now it's, Yuri, you probably don't know what a 1A notice is. Mark, you might remember what a 1A notice was. But I was supposed to.
You were headed to.
Yeah, I was headed to the rice paddies. Okay. And my whole time in Columbia from 63 to 67 was under the threat of being drafted. You left us because we were there under a student exemption. Okay. If you left school for any reason, off you go. Okay. So needless to say, you had all these demonstrations, draft burning. Okay. Draft card burning. Okay. People fleeing to Canada. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That whole thing. And this is the problem. I have to mention this too. Okay. Despite the March on Washington, if you will remember, Mark,
yep.
Despite all of the protests, despite Kent State, okay, which was really kind of the apotheosis of the draft resistance, the war continued. And it really didn't end until Nixon came into power. And even then, it took a number of years until they finally, sort of gave up. So this is the sad part. This is, again, what I'm saying is that if there's going to be a change, it has to come from the top, because I'm not so sure that the people leaving Russia, fleeing, the proscription, are going to affect Russian policy. Everything that I've seen reported coming out of Russia is that, frankly, people are showing up at voyenkomats voluntarily, or they've received their propus and they're showing up.
But how they're treated there is also being shown, and they're treated very poorly.
They're treated. They have to buy their uniforms, for God's sake. They're sleeping on the floor. Absolutely correct. But the fact of the matter is, as far as the Russian government is concerned, and certainly the military, they think they've got a sort of a huge pool of people that they can draft. So I'm very skeptical about whether or not this is going to, just the mere fact that you have people fleeing and that you have these long lines of cars and at the various checkpoints, that this is going to have an effect, that this is going to prompt. What's going to stop the war is going to be success on the battlefield. That's what's going to stop the war. If the VSU are going to take over Kherson, okay, and most of Zaporizhia and get into Lugansk, what's going to happen is Putin is going to start screaming at the general staff at the army, and then there's Kadyrov, who's stoking the fire and saying, there's what's this, Girkin and those crowd are saying, well, we should be doing this, and Kadyrov saying you should bomb, you should use nuclear weapons and all of this crap, and it's going to put the general staff, it's going to put the army, the top leadership of the army. I'm convinced that the top leadership of the army, amongst themselves, are quietly saying, what the hell did we get into? There's no reason for us to be doing this, and this is going to end badly for everyone. When that group gets combined with political, maybe even senior FSB people, and they're going to say, and they're going to get together, and because they have the arms, they have the weapons, and they're going to turn to Putin and say, okay, we're going to let you go like we let Khrushchev go after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
All right, Mark.
Well, I don't know what I could add to that.
Right.
Than what Putin is doing, which I think is a great tragedy, is basically a suicide of Russia. I lived in the country from 2007, 2008 to 2015. I went to work. I lived in the country. I interacted. There was so much potential. There were so many things happening. Yeah. The NGO world, the business world, malls were opening, stores were opening, businesses were opening, and all of that's come to an end. And I think beyond the war, there's going to be a tectonic shift has happened where Russia has been somehow self-cut off. It cut itself off from the rest of the world, which I think for the country is deeply, deeply, deeply tragic.
Well, with that in mind, if there's anything you can count on with Russia is that there's going to be more immigrants. And so I'm very excited that we got to have this conversation. And with me were Peter Basilevsky and Mark Pomar. Mark, I never had a chance to give you kind of the proper introduction, but
my fault.
Right. Peter totally, his grandfather's temper must be, showing itself. But you wrote a book, Cold War Radio, and we're going to continue this conversation, and people should go and get the book and stuff. And unless you want to say something about it now, I feel like I should give you a chance.
Quickly, I am now being flooded with requests for book talks. So I am
excellent.
To Santa Fe in a few days. Then I'm off to Boston at the Fletcher School. Then I'm out to Columbia to give a presentation. I'm out to Stanford to give a presentation. In between, I have various Zoom meetings set up. So if you're interested, Peter, I can send you some of the Zoom meetings if you want to just.
No, when are you at Columbia?
They can't make up their mind whether it's the 15th or the 14th of November or the 16th of November. But if you're in town, come.
I may come in. Is this at the Harriman School?
Have dinner or something.
Is this at the Harriman School?
Yeah, Harriman. I'm on their board of advisors or whatever.
Okay.
So
let me know when you're coming in.
It's definitely.
I'll grab a train and come into New York.
Come in and we will go for a long, long dinner. We've got a lot of things to talk about. But I find myself agreeing with you so overwhelmingly that I've yet to have that experience. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I'm glad when I can facilitate a good conversation like that. You're listening and watching Rashkin Report. Hit like, subscribe. Sometimes we broadcast in English, and it's kind of a different experience. Well, thanks to my guest, and Slava Ukraini.
Slava